A jar of meat sitting on a shelf, no refrigerator, no freezer, no vacuum seal machine, no electricity of any kind. The meat has been sitting there for 4 months already, and it will still be sitting there, perfectly preserved, safe to eat, nutritionally intact for another 2 months after that. The jar cost nothing. It came from a pickle someone ate last year. The shelf is just a shelf. And the only thing standing between that meat and the bacterial decay that should have destroyed it weeks, Ago is something you can buy at any grocery store in the world for less than $2 a kilogram. Something so ordinary that you walk past it every time you shop without thinking about it. Something so ancient that human civilization as we know it would not have been possible without it. Salt, just salt. And the knowledge of exactly how to use it, knowledge that fed armies, built empires, crossed oceans, and survived every catastrophe in human history, is knowledge that most people alive today have never been taught and can barely imagine needing. $2 of salt, 6 months of food storage, no power, no special equipment, no freeze-drying machine that costs $400, no Mylar bags and oxygen absorbers ordered from a prepper website. Just salt, time, and a method so well understood and so thoroughly proven across thousands of years that the only surprising thing about it is how completely it has disappeared from the practical knowledge base of the modern world. What you're about to learn is not a trick. It's not a hack. It's the foundation of human food preservation, the technology that made long voyages possible, that fed cities through winters, that allowed the first complex civilizations to exist because food could finally be stored and transported without rotting. It worked then. It works now. It will work after every supply chain, every power grid, and every refrigerator on Earth has stopped working. And it costs $2. The credibility of salt preservation is not in question by anyone who has studied food history, food science, or traditional food culture. The ancient Egyptians used salt to preserve fish from the Nile in quantities large enough to feed a civilization of millions. Salt-preserved fish appear in tomb paintings dating to 3000 BCE and in archaeological food remnants throughout the Nile Delta. The Roman Empire's salary, the word from which we get the English word salary, was partly paid in salt because salt was considered valuable enough to constitute wages. Roman soldiers were evaluated partly by whether they were worth their salt. The entire transatlantic cod trade that funded European colonization of the Americas was built on salt-preserved fish. Dried and salted cod packed in barrels could survive a 6-week ocean crossing and arrive nutritious and edible at the other end. The Viking longship voyages that reached North America centuries before Columbus were provisioned with salt-preserved meat. Ancient Chinese civilization used salt curing to preserve pork and fish as a staple food storage practice documented for over 3,000 years. The city of Carthage built its economic power partly on salted fish exports. The Hanseatic League, the medieval German trading federation that dominated northern European commerce for centuries, ran substantially on the herring salting industry. There is not a single advanced human civilization in recorded history that did not use salt preservation as a core food technology. And yet, in a modern kitchen, the average person has no practical idea how to use it. Here's why that knowledge disappeared so completely in the span of roughly 2 generations. Refrigeration, the electric kind, the kind that requires a functioning power grid and a monthly electricity bill, became universally accessible in developed countries between roughly 1950 and 1975. In that same period, the food industry built an entire infrastructure around cold chain logistics, refrigerated trucks, refrigerated warehouses, refrigerated display cases, and the consumer refrigerator and freezer as the assumed universal food preservation method. In that context, the knowledge of how to preserve food without refrigeration became not just unnecessary, but actually counterproductive to the industry that had formed around the cold chain. Processed and packaged foods with chemical preservatives replaced home-preserved foods. Supermarket supply chains replaced pantry-based food storage. The assumption became that food storage is something that happens before the food reaches you, in factories and distribution centers, and your job is simply to buy it, refrigerate it briefly, and consume it before it spoils. Teaching people to salt, cure their own meat and vegetables, and store them for 6 months without power would reduce supermarket visits, reduce processed food purchases, and reduce dependency on the cold chain infrastructure that generates so enormous commercial value. So instead of being taught in school alongside reading and arithmetic, instead of being passed from parents to children as basic life competency, it became a niche interest of food historians, a curiosity of chefs interested in traditional techniques, and the daily practice of the small number of cultures that never stopped doing it. They didn't forbid this knowledge, they just made it unnecessary, and then built a world where the thing that made it unnecessary can stop working without warning, and most people have no idea what to do next. You already understand the principle even if you've never applied it. Think about what happens when you slice a cucumber and sprinkle salt on it. Within minutes, water begins pooling on the surface of the cucumber. And the salt is pulling moisture out of the cells. You've seen this. You've done this. What you were watching is osmosis, the tendency of water to move through a semi-permeable membrane from an area of lower salt concentration to an area of higher salt concentration. The cucumber cells have high water content and low salt concentration. The surface of the cucumber, covered in salt, has high salt concentration. Water moves outward to try to equalize the difference. Now apply that same principle to bacteria, the microorganisms that cause food to rot and become dangerous. Bacteria are also cells with high water content and low salt concentration. In a sufficiently salty environment, the same osmotic process that drew water out of your cucumber draws water out of bacterial cells. The bacteria dehydrate. They can no longer reproduce. They die. The food environment becomes hostile to the organisms that would otherwise destroy it. This is not a chemical reaction, it is physics. The same physics that operates in every cell of every living thing. Salt doesn't poison bacteria with a toxin. It removes the water they need to exist, and without water, nothing rots. Here's how you actually do it. Starting with the most fundamental and versatile method, dry salt curing. You need salt. Non-iodized salt is strongly preferred because iodine inhibits the fermentation processes that contribute to flavor and can interfere with preservation chemistry. Kosher salt or pure pickling salt works perfectly and costs almost nothing. You need your food, meat, fish, or vegetables, and you need a clean, non-reactive container. Glass jars, ceramic crocks, or food-grade plastic containers all work. For meat preservation, calculate roughly 30 to 40 grams of salt per kilogram of meat. This is the baseline ratio that creates an inhospitable environment for spoilage organisms while remaining palatable when the preserved meat is eventually prepared and rinsed. Coat every surface of the meat completely with salt, pressing it firmly into any folds or crevices where moisture and bacteria could hide. Place the salted meat into your container in layers, pressing down firmly to eliminate air, pockets between pieces. If you have more meat, add more salt between each layer. Seal the container and store it in the coolest, darkest location available. A root cellar, a basement, a shaded corner of a room. The salt will draw moisture from the meat, creating a brine that surrounds and further preserves the pieces. Check after the first week. If any meat surface is exposed above the brine level, add a small amount of prepared brine made from 35 grams of salt dissolved in 1 liter of water to keep everything submerged. For thin cuts of meat or fish, preservation to an edible state takes 1 to 2 weeks. For thick cuts, whole legs, large roasts, allow 4 to 6 weeks of curing before the salt has penetrated fully to the center. Properly salt-cured meat, stored cool and dry, lasts months to years. The oldest continuously documented food preservation method in human history produces results measured not in days but in seasons. For vegetables, the method is lacto-fermentation in brine, a variation on salt preservation that produces not just preserved food, but food that is actively enhanced in nutritional value and digestibility through the activity of beneficial lactic acid bacteria. The ratio is simpler, 2 to 3% salt by weight dissolved in water, roughly 20 grams of salt per liter. Pack your vegetables tightly into a clean glass jar. Pour brine over them until they are completely submerged. Weigh them down with a small stone or a folded cabbage leaf to keep everything below the brine surface. Cover the jar with cloth secured by a rubber band, not a sealed lid, because the fermentation process produces carbon dioxide and needs to breathe. Leave it at room temperature, away from direct sunlight, for 3 to 7 days. Taste as you go. When the flavor is pleasantly sour and the vegetables still have satisfying texture, seal the jar and move it to cool storage. The lactic acid produced by fermentation provides an additional preservation layer beyond the salt alone, dropping the pH of the food to a level where harmful bacteria cannot survive. Sauerkraut made this way, simply cabbage and salt, lasts 6 months to a year in cool storage. The same method preserves cucumbers, carrots, beets, green beans, peppers, garlic, and virtually every other vegetable, with minimal variation in technique. Here is what most people get wrong when they try this for the first time, because the mistakes are consistent, and the consequences of getting them wrong range from disappointing to genuinely dangerous. First mistake, using iodized table salt. Standard iodized table salt, the kind in the blue cylindrical container, contains iodine added to prevent thyroid deficiency. That iodine inhibits the lactic acid bacteria responsible for fermentation, produces off flavors in cured meat, and can cause discoloration in vegetables. Use pure pickling salt, kosher salt, or sea salt with no additives. Read the ingredient label. Salt should be the only ingredient. Second mistake, insufficient salt concentration. Undersalting is where food preservation fails and becomes food safety risk. Having the salt ratio to reduce saltiness does not produce a gentler, more palatable preserved food. It produces inadequately preserved food that can support dangerous bacterial growth, including Clostridium botulinum, the organism responsible for botulism. The preservation ratios exist for microbiological reasons. They are not aesthetic guidelines. Follow them. Third mistake, allowing air exposure in fermented vegetables. Any vegetable surface above the brine line will mold, not always dangerously, but consistently and unpleasantly. Keep everything submerged. If mold appears on the surface of the brine itself, skim it off and discard the top layer of vegetables. If mold appears throughout the jar or on the vegetables themselves below the brine line, discard the batch and start again. Surface mold on brine is a nuisance. Mold throughout the jar is a failure condition. Fourth mistake, sealing fermentation jars airtight. Carbon dioxide production during active fermentation will build pressure in a sealed jar. At best, you open it to an explosive spray of brine. At worst, the jar cracks or fails in a way that's genuinely unpleasant. Cover fermentation jars with breathable cloth during active fermentation. Switch to a proper sealed lid only after moving to cold storage when fermentation has largely stopped. Fifth mistake, rushing the process. Salt curing and fermentation operate on timelines set by physics and microbiology, not by your schedule. A thick pork leg cured for 2 weeks instead of 4 may appear preserved at the surface while the center remains inadequately salted, a genuine food safety concern. Follow the timeline. The process cannot be accelerated without specialized equipment. The results, properly executed, are genuinely remarkable in their scope and practicality. 2. Kilograms of salt, available at any grocery store for under $4, provides enough preservative material to cure roughly 50 kilograms of meat or to produce sufficient lacto-fermented vegetable brine for dozens of jars of preserved produce. A household that understands salt preservation and applies it systematically at harvest, or when meat is available, can build a pantry of 6 months of food storage requiring no electricity, no specialized containers beyond glass jars, and no ongoing cost or maintenance. In practical terms, a family of 4 growing or buying seasonal produce at peak abundance and salt preserving it can eat preserved vegetables through an entire winter. A hunter or livestock keeper who processes an animal and salt cures the meat can feed that family for months from a single animal that would otherwise require a chest freezer to store. The scaling is immediate. More salt, more food preserved. The infrastructure required is a shelf and a cool room. Address the safety concerns honestly because they are legitimate and important. Can improperly salt-preserved food make you seriously ill? Yes. Undersalting, improper technique, and contaminated equipment can allow dangerous organisms to survive or proliferate. This is not a casual concern to dismiss. It is the reason the ratios, the submersion requirements, and the timing guidelines exist. Follow them with the same seriousness you'd apply to any food safety practice. The method is safe when executed correctly. It has been the primary food preservation method of every human civilization for thousands of years, but correctly means precisely, not approximately. Is high sodium intake a health concern with regularly eating salt-preserved foods? It can be for people with specific medical conditions. The standard practice with cured meat is to rinse thoroughly before cooking, and to soak in fresh water for several hours to draw excess salt back out, a step traditional recipes have always included. Fermented vegetables consumed in reasonable quantities as condiments or sides rather than as the primary food source represent a modest sodium contribution to the diet. Can this method preserve everything? No. Salt preservation works best with meat, fish, and vegetables with reasonably firm cell structure. Foods with very high fat content cure differently and require modified techniques. Dairy preservation uses different salt-based methods, cheese being the most significant example. The method is broad but not unlimited. Go back 6,000 years and the relationship between salt and human survival was understood at a level we have almost entirely lost. In ancient Egypt, salt was used not only to preserve food, but to preserve the dead. Mummification used natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture, to prevent the decomposition of bodies intended to last eternity. The Egyptians understood that salt removed water and water removal stopped decay, and they applied that, understanding to both their food supply and their religious practice. Salt production was a state-controlled industry in ancient China as early as the 6th century BCE. The government understood that controlling salt meant controlling survival itself. The Roman roads built across Europe were constructed partly to move salt to the frontier armies that couldn't survive without it. Medieval European cities were often founded near salt sources or at points on salt trade routes because salt was not a seasoning, it was infrastructure. It was the technology that made it possible to have a food supply that could survive winter survive transport, survive war, survive anything that disrupted the growing and eating of fresh food in real time. The people who built every civilization you've ever read about in a history book understood this at a depth we have completely lost. They knew that salt was not a flavor preference. It was the difference between eating and starving when the season changed or the supply chain broke, which returns us to the thought that sits underneath every video in this series. We are the most technically sophisticated, most information-rich, most connected civilization in human history. And the average person in that civilization cannot preserve a piece of meat without electricity, cannot store food for 6 months without a supply chain delivering replacements when the previous supply runs out, cannot do what every person for the previous 6,000 years of human existence could do as basic practical knowledge. Extend the life of food beyond its natural spoilage date using nothing but a mineral that falls out of evaporated seawater. We outsource that knowledge to refrigerators and supermarkets and the assumption that the system supporting those things will always be running. That assumption has been comfortable for 70 years. It has also made us deeply, practically helpless in ways our great-grandparents would have found genuinely difficult to understand. They didn't know about processors or cloud storage or streaming services, but they knew what to do with a piece of meat and a handful of salt. And in the hierarchy of survival knowledge, that one is harder to replace. If this video made you want to buy a bag of pickling salt in a jar and start learning the most fundamental food preservation skill in human history, if it made you realize that the security of having months of food that doesn't need power is something $2 and an afternoon can begin building, then share it with someone who thinks food storage requires expensive equipment. Because the knowledge is older than money, the salt is cheaper than a coffee, and the shelf life of what you can build with both of them outlasts almost everything else in your kitchen.